Let me say welcome to everyone. I'm very excited to be able to say a few words about our guest here today. We're delighted to have Daphne Koller here with us. I don't know how to describe Daphne all that well, but I will tell you a few things about her. Any list that was a proper introduction would go on for far too long for someone who I know is more modest than she needs to be. It might suffice it to say that I think she's changed the world in the last 10 months. And that the last time I saw Daphne on TED, she was being interviewed by Tom Friedman on a panel with Bill Gates, Sebastian Thrun, Peter Thiel, Larry Summers, and I think Jimmy Wales got to ask the first question in the audience. And Raphael Reif. We'll leave. We won't leave out MIT's president. We won't leave them out. The guy who barely got on the panel, if I could say it. But it was a really, really impressive group, and so we're delighted to have her here today. I wanted to say that, even had you not co-founded Coursera, Daphne's career would be amazing by anyone's standards. Just to say a few words, she works in the area of machine learning. She's received the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers, a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship, the ACM Infosys Award. She's a member of the National Academy of Engineering, an award-winning teacher, and she's got about 2.6 million users per month on Coursera, a company that launched last April, that I think. In terms of startup, this has got to be a year to beat all years in terms of going from zero to everything overnight, and I know that the world is just getting faster and more challenging, but we couldn't be more thrilled to have you here at the University of Virginia and the Darden School of Business, to hear from you, to learn from you, to ask questions, to empathize with you, and to hear what's on your mind. So without further ado, please help me give a warm welcome to Daphne Koller.
Thank you, Peter, for that very embarrassing introduction. And I'm at your disposal to answer questions, or I could start by saying a little bit about the history of Coursera just to get the conversation started, and then I promise not to take more than a few minutes on that. Andrew Ng is my co-founder at Coursera. We're both Stanford faculty members, and we had both been doing online education in our roles as Stanford faculty kind of as a hobby, because it wasn't like the main research agenda for either of us. We approached it from different directions. My initial interest in this was just to change the way we teach, observing that lecture goes back over 300 years to the time when there was a single copy of the book, and it was the only way to get the content of the book to the students was to have the professor stand there and read the book. That's where lecture originated, and it seems like we should have moved beyond that by now. And so my interest in this was how to change the way we teach on campus initially. Andrew's interest was more in the open courseware side of things. He wanted to take Stanford courses and put them up online, and there's a terrible echo. So anyway, at some point we each started to develop ideas on how to teach effectively online, develop technology, pedagogy, infrastructure, design of what an online system ought to look like. And about a year or a year and a half before we founded Coursera, so about two and a half years ago, our paths coalesced when we realized that the questions were very similar, and that in fact there was a great leverage to be had by dual purposing the same content and the same design to offer both to on-campus students as well as to people who would never in the normal course of events have access to a Stanford or UVA quality education. And so that was something that generated a fair bit of interest and excitement on campus, and culminated in the fall of 2011, so about, 16 months ago, with the offering of the three first MOOCs, I guess, the three first massive open online courses that were computer science courses from Stanford that each had an enrollment of about 100,000 students or more. And I think when Andrew and I looked at that phenomenon, we realized that there was an opportunity there that it would be a sin not to take advantage of and not to live up to that opportunity. Because when you can offer what is maybe not 100%, but a good percent of the Stanford quality experience to students in 196 countries at a marginal cost per student that is closer to $0 than to $1. That seems like something that you just couldn't pass up. And so Andrew and I effectively each kind of, I don't know if gave up, but put to the side the things that we were doing research on, and decided to basically do something about that. We spun this out of Stanford at the end of the fall, created Coursera, and started to try and see if there were other top institutions besides Stanford who would want to be part of this, who would want to offer free education to students everywhere, as well as an improved education to their own on-campus students. And so, as Peter said, we were in stealth mode for about 3 months. We launched in April of 2012, so about 9 months ago. At that time, we had 200,000 legacy students from the Stanford courses that took place in the fall. 4 months later, we hit 1 million students. About 4 months after that, we were 2 million. We're now close to 2.7 million students. And a statistic that I heard just yesterday. We have an analytics team, and they did the stats. We have 1.45 million course enrollments per month, new course enrollments per month, which is it's a number that blows my mind. I don't know about yours.
It's more than ours.
Maybe not the changes.
So now we started out in April with 4 institutions that were partnering with us, Stanford, Princeton, Penn, and Michigan. In July, we grew to 16, of which UVA was 1. So 12 more joined in July. Another 17 joined in September. So we're now 33 institutions. Proud to say that it's no longer a US-only effort. We have 8 non-US institutions now, including ones that teach in languages other than English, and that's going to be something you're going to see a whole lot more of, international involvement and non-English content in a very short time frame. So I don't know. I think that's sort of a very broad summary of where we are. We have 220 some courses. It's hard to keep track because new ones get added every day. One of the things that we're also really proud of is that we offer courses across a range of disciplines, so not just math courses or even just STEM courses. We have courses in business, including from here at Darden. We have courses in philosophy from other parts of UVA and from other institutions. We have courses in poetry, in literature, in medicine, in design, in performance music. And one of the things that we've found is that human learning is something that people want to learn things in all disciplines, and that's really exciting to us because we weren't necessarily expecting that. We thought that it might be the case that people would primarily take courses that are beneficial to them for their career, but it turns out that our single biggest class so far is the philosophy class from Duke that has learn how to reason, think, and argue or something that has 180,000 students registered in that one class. So it's really, I think, very gratifying to see that learning is useful to people and something that they care enough to invest a lot of effort in, not just when it's necessarily useful for their careers. So that's sort of a very high-level summary, and I'm happy to take questions on pretty much anything.
I'll take the mic to somebody. Let me get a question.
I can talk out loud. It's okay.
It's recorded. We appreciate waiting for the mic.
Thank you. Would you describe the Two Sigma problem that you mentioned in your TED Talk, and then
Sure.
if there's any new data on it that you've discovered?
Yep.
Second, would you talk about where iTunes University kind of falls into this? That's the 2 parts. Thank you.
So the Two Sigma problem is not something that I invented. It was in a paper that dates back almost 30 years to in 1984. Educational researcher Benjamin Bloom studied 3 populations of students. There was one population who studied in a traditional lecture-based classroom, and he studied the distribution of their achievement scores in some standardized tests. The students who participate in a lecture-based classroom, but in a mastery-based format, which means that they are required to achieve competency in topic 1 before they move on to topic 2, so it gives them a better foundation to build on. And the third population was students who had a personalized human tutor. And Benjamin Bloom showed in data from more than one experiment along these lines that the students who have the mastery-based lecture perform a full standard deviation, or sigma as it's called in statistics, better than the traditional lecture. And the people who have the personalized learning perform 2 standard deviation, or 2 sigma better than the lecture-based population. So, and he pointed out that if you pick the midpoint of the lecture-based distribution as a performance threshold, so that in the lecture-based population, half of the students are performing adequately or better and the other half isn't, for that same threshold in the personal tutoring format, 98% of students are above that threshold. So that's a huge improvement in learning outcomes. The problem, of course, as Bloom correctly pointed out, is that as a society, we can't afford an individual human tutor for every student. We just can't. And so the title of the paper was Finding Methods of Group Instruction That Are As Effective as Individual Tutoring. And the whole paper was, okay, how do we solve this problem? How do we achieve that learning outcome without the resources to spend on a human tutor for every student? And so really, I think there's 2 pieces to the observation that Bloom made in his paper. One is mastery learning, and the other is personalization of the learning experience to individual students and the needs of individual students. And I think actually, and I apologize for those of you who are going to come to my talk today because I go through it there, I think mastery is actually easy to do in a computer, because the nice thing about computers is that they're quite happy for you to sit there and watch the same video 5 times. They don't care. There is a really nice, so as value added, because I'm not going to say this in the lecture this afternoon, there's a really nice testimonial on the Khan Academy website where someone basically says that they had failed math in high school their entire career. They were C students, and he wanted to be an engineer, and he couldn't be an engineer because he didn't have the math background. And then he discovered Khan Academy when he was an adult. And he says that, and I'm almost quoting verbatim, that there's no human tutor that would not have become judgmental at having to explain the same thing 7 times. But he watched the same video 7 times, and he worked his way all the way from 4th grade math, multiplying decimals, all the way through high school math, and is now studying engineering at a respectable college. And I mean, I think that's awesome. So that ability to achieve mastery is, I think, a really valuable part of the student learning experience that you can achieve in an online format that you just cannot achieve with traditional modes of instruction. And now as to whether we have any data on that, so we actually started to study this. So one of the nice aspects of the kind of grading mechanisms that we had to put in place is that you get instant feedback. So the students immediately know whether they're getting it or they're not. So compare that to what happens when you're doing a homework for your Darden class. You study the material week 1, the homework comes out week 2, you submit it week 3, by the time you get it back it's week 5. You look at the work and you say, darn it, I only got 70 out of 100, that's too bad. And that's it, that's the end of the story. You never go back and redo it because by this point the class has moved on. Well, here, because of the immediate feedback, it naturally lends itself to a game in students' minds. And they say, 70 out of 100, I can do better than that. And then they resubmit, and they resubmit again. And you look at the distribution of the scores, you see that students submit multiple times, and they eventually, most of them end up with a perfect score. Now, the question that you might say is, okay, well, is that any good? Is it useful to submit again and again? Does that actually help learning outcomes, or does it just improve your score on this one assignment? And so some of the data that I'll show in the talk this afternoon shows that correcting for a student's initial performance on assignment 1, say, the students who do this mastery-based learning unsolicited, just choose to do it, do better on the initial submission on problem set 2 than the ones who don't. So mastery learning doesn't just help you on the problem set that you're doing it for, but also helps you on the next problem set down the line. So it actually helps. Personalization, I think, is a little trickier. We can do some of that with, having students progress at their own pace and watch videos multiple times, like the guy in the Khan Academy testimonial, and so on. But I think that, obviously there's a long way to go before we can get a computer to give you the same kind of personal attention that the human tutor gives you. And I think it's a really exciting research problem for us to tackle. Okay, so that was the first question. Second question is easier. I mean, how does this compare to iTunes? iTunes is passive content. It's video. I mean, and there's a lot of that in different types of open courseware efforts of different types. And I'm not dismissing the value of that by any stretch, but it's really not the same kind of interactive course experience that we can provide to students right now.
Question is more towards maintaining the quality and the operational aspect of it. So you mentioned that there are 1.4 million people, new subscriber to each different courses at Coursera. So first question is, how do you choose or pick up the instructors and maintain the quality as it is going beyond one geography? Second question is, you also mentioned that there are 180,000 students for this philosophy course. So how do you actually maintain or try to improve the interaction between students? Because there is an argument that if you have a small class size, everyone gets a chance to raise their questions and get answers for that. Mm-hmm. So I would love to know your response.
Okay, so is everybody going to ask me two completely unrelated questions? I'm just curious. So let's see. So the answer to the first question, quality control. We have attempted to account for that by working with the best institutions like UVA or Princeton or Stanford or Caltech or Columbia and so on, that have really great faculty, and perhaps equally importantly, because the course goes out under the university brand, they care about quality at least as much as we do, because it's their reputation that's at stake at least as much as ours. And so we rely to some extent on the institution to perform the quality control. And by and large, it's worked out pretty well for us. I'm not going to say that there haven't been cases that we would have liked to see done better, but I think we're all learning, and sometimes the initial version of something isn't as good as we could make it, but the next version will be. And I think by and large, we've been very fortunate in the quality of the courses that we've been able to put together. And it is by working through institutions as opposed to directly with faculty, which was one of the design choices that we made very early on in selecting the model in which Coursera would work, is that we were going to do this by institutional partnerships only. And we get, I don't know, dozens of emails every week from individual instructors saying, I'd love to offer my course on Coursera. And some of them sound pretty darn good. I mean, award-winning and so on and so forth. But as a matter of policy, we don't go that route. Because we think there is a tremendous quality benefit to be gained by having the institution provide support, provide quality control, provide resources. And there's also benefit to the students from having the course being offered under the institutional brand. So that's the first question. What was the second question?
So it's about the students.
The students, that's right. So, I think that there is a, counterintuitively, we actually find that somehow large courses are better than small courses, because there's a richer community for you to draw on. And we actually have data supporting that. It'll be in the talk today as well, that the response time, for example, to questions that are asked on the discussion forum is actually considerably lower in large classes than in small classes. There's just more people to answer them. Anecdotally, the quality of the answers seems to be higher as well. So I think that what we've done effectively is replaced the sort of bottleneck of the instructor being the sort of center point for all questions that need to be answered with a many-to-many interaction. And many-to-many actually increases. The amount of interaction you get increases quadratically with the number of students, as opposed to when you have a single instructor, it decreases linearly with the number of students. And so it's, yeah.
Hi, I have only one question. Have you ever thought of having like a membership fee? I thought everything is free, and that's why the impact is so huge so far. But I just kind of curious about membership, then collect and make something new, or yeah.
Have we thought about it? Certainly, even if only because we've been asked that question a number of times. I mean, people say, why don't you charge $5? It's the price of a latte at Starbucks. And why don't you, I mean, if we charged $5 for every student who came in through our doors, we would be profitable instantly. But I think there's really two questions to be asked. One is the business question, the second is the moral question. And I think I'm going to start with the first one because it's less interesting. From a business perspective, it's not clear that if you have that friction point of a $5 fee at the beginning, that you're going to get the same kinds of audiences that we get right now. So it's not clear that it's actually a better business model. I don't know. We haven't tried it. We haven't even modeled it. And the reason we haven't modeled it is because of the second answer to the question. $5 might not be a lot for somebody here sitting in this room, but it's a heck of a lot of money for a kid in Africa. And what we'd really like to do is we'd like to have education be something that's basically free. It's a right. It's not a privilege. And we hope to be able to find other ways to bring in revenue to make this sustainable, and we're working on that. We have some stuff that we've put into place already, and I guess we'll have to see whether it pans out or not.
I'm going to ask the question while the mic's being passed, even though I'm the mic passer. So this is, thank you. I guess I have two questions. One's really simple. When you go back and are allowed to take a test again, do you shuffle up the questions?
It depends on the instructor. If the instructor gives us randomization, then randomization takes place. Academic standards are up to the instructor. Everything, content design, question design, everything.
Because it seems like if you get the same list of questions, some people might just write down the answers and move forward.
We try very hard to encourage instructors to introduce randomization into their question bank.
Okay, awesome. And then my second question is, what is your demographic makeup of the students? So like right now, and how is it going to threaten degree granting universities? Like for instance, Penn State has a massive online learning degree campus, and then University of Phoenix. So how does that?
These are yeah. That's
Sorry,
a bit,
multiple. I'm done.
Okay, so that was 3 questions. I will say that, making up for the one question that we had over there. Let's see. So I've answered the first. Demographic mix. We're about 60% male, 40% female, which is not bad. It could be better. About a third US, I think 20-some% Europe, and then the remainder are in Asia, South America. We have about close to 4% in Africa, which is not enormous, but it's pretty good. Primarily in South Africa, and Nigeria, and one other, I forget which one. And we have I should say that most of these are based on self-reported answers from surveys, and so there might be a bias in that. So just take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. Of the students who've responded, about 80% actually have college degrees, of whom about half have advanced degrees, so a master's or a PhD. That is partially, I think, because the content that we started out with, universities initially gave us the content that they considered their highlight, which is often advanced content, their lecture on quantum physics kind of thing, and not quite as much of the basics. That's changing right now. A lot of the courses that have recently come online or that are coming online soon are introductory, biology, chemistry, math, and so on and so forth. And so I think that the demographic is going to change. The other reason it's going to change, I think, is because of potentially a solution to the accreditation problem. That is, how do you give people credit towards a degree, which of course for the people who don't have degrees is absolutely critical for having them get value for these courses. So that's why I think we have 80% who are basically continuing education. But I will say that in some sense, maybe it shouldn't be a complete surprise because you get your basic post-secondary education for the first 4 to 6 or 8 years of your adult life, but then there's the 40 years that come after. And I think the world is moving too quickly now for the stuff that you learned in college 15 years ago to be good enough to stay a productive member of society. And so that's why we're seeing a lot of lifelong learning happening on the platform. So that's I think, a short answer on the demographics. Third question? Penn State and Phoenix. Different answers because those are very different institutions. We are not a degree granting institution, have no intention of becoming a degree granting institution. So in some respects, we do not substitute for a traditional college, even an online college. I do think that there's going to be an interesting shift in both residential and non-residential colleges in terms of the student experiences that they offer their students, because for many colleges, not all of them, probably not most UVA classes, but enough other colleges, the primary value proposition that the college offered its students was content and accreditation. And content is about to become free and ubiquitous. High quality content is about to become free and ubiquitous. And so that cannot be the value proposition anymore. And I don't think it's going to be just about accreditation, because that problem too will be solved. There will be people who will give you a degree for taking online courses. So universities are going to have to find a different value proposition to their students. And I think that value proposition exists. If a university is thoughtful about this, there's mentorship of faculty, there's project-based learning, active learning in the classroom, networking between students, networking with alumni, internship opportunities, volunteering opportunities. I mean, you can make a whole list of things that an institution could encourage its students to participate in and provide huge value in terms of the residential education. But you're going to see, I think, institutions that do that and do very well, and institutions that don't, and I think those are going to struggle.
She made up for my 2 questions. I was going to ask about demographics and accreditation, so thanks.
Thank you. I have one question. I guess you know you caused a bit of a stir around here this past summer.
I didn't. I had nothing to do with it.
But you know, there's of course been a lot of debate now about MOOCs and their value, and of course the promise is that they'll reach a very, very broad audience. And you probably have read the criticisms, including the New York Times yesterday, their editorial, about that not that many students complete the classes. I'm not going to ask you to respond to that. What I want to ask you to respond to is, what do you know about the people who do complete the classes? Like, is there a profile, or is there a certain kind of learner that this format really, really works for?
You know, I don't think we've done that analysis in a way that I can provide an intelligent answer to that question. We looked at the data a little bit, and you know, we looked at the core demographics of completers and non-completers in terms of years of education, gender, country of origin. It was hard to spot significant differences. I mean, in some courses, Indians tend to complete more than other nations, maybe because you could start spinning a story around why Indians would complete more than others, but I just don't know if that's true, if those stories are true. So I don't think we have done enough analysis, and I'm also not sure that we have enough data yet to start answering that question, because there's a huge variability across courses in completion rates, and it could be a function of, we know it's a function of at least course length, how engaging the instructor is, the amount of work that the course has week to week, and so on and so forth. But we have completed, I don't know, maybe 80 courses, and that's 80 data points. And 80 data points is not enough.
Just a follow-up question. So it seems that you are able to gather a fair amount of demographic data about your users.
That's right.
Are you able to also gather psychographic data, or anything about, kind of the users, segments of users?
What is, I'm sorry, I don't know what psychographic.
So, well, like what would motivate? Like, if you may not be able to say women complete more often than men, but you may be able to say that people of a certain personality type, or who are more driven by intrinsic rewards, tend to complete the course more often.
And you would do this based on self-reporting by the users? I mean, how would you measure that?
I'm not exactly sure. That's why I'm asking you.
So, we haven't done those questions yet. We've mostly focused on sort of fairly hardcore objective data, like years of education and things like that. We haven't tried to estimate psychographic profiles. But I can answer the retention question. Should I answer the retention question? Okay. So actually, it's a two-part answer, even though it wasn't a two-part question. In fact, it was a zero-part question. You weren't even asking the question. So I want to say two things. I want to respond specifically to the New York Times article. How many of you have read the New York Times editorial from yesterday? Maybe not that many. New York Times article. New York Times, it came out yesterday with an editorial talking about, all this MOOC stuff is overblown because students have a serious issue with completing online classes. They have an even worse time completing MOOCs, but even traditional online classes have lower completion rates, and especially for students in particularly disadvantaged populations like community college students, they do worse in online classes than in traditional face-to-face classes. And so somebody sent me that article and said, what's your response to this? And I said that evaluating the quote-unquote efficacy of an online class is the same as evaluating the fuel efficiency of an automobile. I mean, you have the Prius and you have the Ferrari, and even asking the question just doesn't make sense unless you stratify courses a little bit more finely. There are online classes that are I think probably the majority of the ones that were studied in these studies that report significant dropout rates in community college students who take online classes that are just absolutely abysmal. I mean, basically it's a bunch of text on the screen. There's the occasional question that gets asked. Sometimes you're supposed to, type in some question that the instructor assesses down the line. There's minimal interaction with the instructor, no interaction with other students. The material is presented in a very unengaging format. I would drop out of that class. I mean, it doesn't surprise me that the dropout rates are high. So I think that before one really takes those statistics seriously, it's important to sort of drill down and figure out what is the format of these online classes and is it really an engaging experience to begin with. The second response to that is that I recognize that, and I'm still responding to the New York Times editorial, that it's clearly the case that not every student has the intrinsic motivation and the ability to, in a self-driven way, complete an online class without any kind of human support. I think there is a number of students, I don't know if I can estimate the percentage, but let me throw out 15 to 25%, who could actually, among the community college type population, I mean, across the board, I mean, if you're talking about the continuing ed population, the number could be much higher, but who could actually complete a MOOC autonomously. The other ones, I don't think this is necessarily the right experience for them. I think a blended learning experience that uses the MOOC content or an online course content, but one that's well delivered, as sort of a way of conveying the content, and then has an actual instructor there, whether physically or online, to answer questions, engage the students, make sure they're retained, teach them study skills, and so on and so forth. All those things that a certain fraction of community college students have a serious problem with because they weren't properly taught in high schools in most cases. I think that you need that kind of experience. And the New York Times article does correctly point out that blended learning experiences actually outperform face-to-face. So I think that that's really the way to go for probably the majority of community college students. And arguably the way to go for a majority of students who are fortunate enough to have access to a real live instructor. But that's not the majority of the world's population, and so that's why the autonomous MOOCs still provide a lot of value. So that's the answer to the New York Times editorial. I can also talk about the retention pipeline if people are interested in hearing about that. Okay. So people basically say, okay, only 5 to 10% of students complete a MOOC. And that's, if you had 5 to 10% of people only complete a face-to-face class, we would be throwing that class out the window. I think this is based on a fundamental misconception of why people take a MOOC relative to a standard class. When you enroll for a class at a university, it is with declared intent to actually finish it. If you don't, it's a failure. It's your failure, the system's failure, the instructor's failure. It's a failure in some place in the system. People enroll for a MOOC. They sit there with a bottle of beer at 11 o'clock at night, and they say, ooh, astrobiology sounds awesome. And they click the enroll button. And it has zero friction. And so what happens? About, I don't know, 40 to 50% of the people who click the enroll button never show up to class on the first day because the beer is long gone and they're doing something else now. Of the ones who show up on the first day, about 60% don't submit even a single homework. Now, that doesn't mean they aren't engaged. Some of them are engaged. Some of them are really watching most of the videos. But they don't want to do homework because they figure they're done with school. They've been there, done that. They don't want to submit homework anymore. I can relate to that. So the ones who submit the first homework, the retention rates are actually not that bad. Depending on the kind of class it is, it can range to about as high as 40 to 50% of the students who submit the first homework also submit the last homework. That's not so bad. And you know, it depends on the class. But and I think that that's actually fine, because one of the things that I like about MOOCs is that it provides a mechanism for risk-free exploration. That is, you can try something that you've always wanted to find out about and never really knew what it was, and there's no penalty. You don't pay $400 that you're never going to see back if you decide you don't like it. There's no failure on your transcript if you decide you don't like it. And so people can explore both topics as well as levels of difficulty that they would otherwise might not attempt. So somebody, a high school student, maybe one who's a first-generation college goer, can find out that they're maybe up to taking a Princeton class or a UVA class, and maybe they'll apply to a more selective institution than they would otherwise have dared to try out for. And I think there's a lot of merit to this notion of, yes, it's open, and it's okay for you to try it and not finish it, and I think that's just fine. So.
Being in a business school, I had a question about your business model.
The business model question.
I'm particularly curious how sort of you convince university partners to join you. Sort of what's the sustainable pitch that you give to them for how this is going to last in the long term once the new and excitingness of it is gone?
Okay, so those are actually two different questions again. I mean, there's the question of the business model, which I'll get to in a second. But in terms of the appeal to universities, I actually think that very few universities are actually looking at this as a major revenue source. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's not what we hear. I think they want it to be sustainable, so it's not a constant drain on resources, but I don't think they're looking at it as a way of compensating for reduced state support or reductions in tuitions and fees. They are viewing it as a number of other things. There is the transformation of teaching on campus is a huge factor for many universities. This is a way of breaking instruction out of the local minimum that it's currently at and moving it somewhere else. There is the learning experience of how to teach online that this really provides an avenue for exploring that. There is the extension of the brand and footprint and impact, which is very powerful for many institutions, because how many things that an institution does reach 100,000 people? I mean, not that many. And so I think there is a huge value to institutions in that as well. And finally, I think that was certainly true for the first few batches of institutions that joined us. I think there was the recognition that this is happening. It's happening with or without the top institutions. And if the top institutions didn't sort of jump in and do something, then they would leave the field open to other players whose commitment to academic standards is maybe not quite as high. And I think that they felt they wanted to be in there shaping the conversation as opposed to not. So I think financial issues are only a very small part of the conversation for most universities, and are only there as a way to make sure that it doesn't basically become a permanent drain. So that having been said, I can answer the business model question, which is a completely different question. Having stated earlier our commitment to free content, so you can't charge for access. We don't want to charge for access. So what do you charge for? We've put in place 3 primary revenue models in the last 3 months. and we're starting to see which of them work. The first one, I'm actually going to start from the end chronologically, is a track that allows students to opt into a more rigorous form of credential, one that's identity verified, that has a stickiness on the platform so that you can come in and verify that the student indeed completed the class. You can share that with an employer, share that with your mother, share that with whoever. And you get a university branded certificate as part of that. And it's not a credit-bearing certificate by and large, but students still find it incredibly valuable. For example, in presenting to employers. It's not a very expensive proposition. The cost of this is something like, you know, $40 to $70-ish dollars. So the price of a restaurant meal for two. I was in Minnesota yesterday and I said the price of a restaurant meal. And they said, no, that's in California. We don't pay $70 for a restaurant meal in Minnesota. So that's why I changed it to restaurant meal for two. So in California, you definitely pay $70 in many restaurants for one, but anyway. So I think it's something that has value to students. And because of the open access nature of who we are, we also put in a financial aid option for that. So if you really need a certificate and you can't afford it, you write a financial aid application, you get it for free. And about 20%, 25% of our current students in the track are financial aid students. I think it'll be interesting to see if the retention rates for the financial aid students are the same as the ones who pay. We'll know soon enough. We only put this in place a few weeks ago, so we still are collecting data. That's one revenue model. The second revenue model is one that came to us. It's effectively an unadvertised thing that you could do, but institutions came to us and said, wow, that gamification course from Wharton is an awesome course. We don't have anybody who can teach gamification at our business school or in our institution. We would love to be able to offer this to our students because it's a valuable skill that makes them more marketable. Can we basically license the course? And at that point, the institution pays a per student fee, which can be paid by the institution. It can be paid by the student. I mean, up to the institution, kind of like a textbook. And basically, the institutions are offering it to their students kind of in a closed site in a blended learning format where a local instructor who doesn't now need to be expert enough to prepare the content can just basically guide the students along and do curation, guidance, and so on and so forth. That's number two. And we've had a lot of interest in that, both domestically and internationally. The third model is more narrow in scope. It's employers who are looking to fill a skills gap. And here, the students can opt in to being sought after for positions. So this is opt-in only. In fact, there's no mistake about this. You need to upload a resume in order to be considered. And the employers can search against the database for students who are high-performing in classes that they think are of particular relevance to the job that they're trying to fill. And then they can reach out to the students. And if the student then chooses to reply to that request, then there is like a relationship that's set up and an interview and so on and so forth. And the employers can either pay kind of like a subscription model for access to the database, or they can pay per placement like a contingency recruiter. We haven't figured out what the right business model there is. I mean, which of those is the right approach to take in this case. But it's something that, again, for certain verticals, information technology, probably medicine, certain aspects of teaching, where there's a huge, huge shortage of teachers in certain areas, STEM teachers or special ed teachers, for example. There is a potential for that, but not across the board.
Hi, thank you for coming. I have a question. So I have a question about pedagogy more. So do you provide support to these institutions as far as the methods of learning and evaluation? And in general, I'd love to hear your insights on methods of learning and evaluation in the future and where it's going.
So we should ask Kristen that, because Kristen can tell you what it looks like. Where's Kristen? What it looks like from the institutional side. Do we provide support, Kristen?
So I'm Kristen. I'm the UVA contact for MOOCs. And so from an institutional perspective, we have an internal team where we go through different process decisions. So we have a teaching resource center on grounds that's available to help try to design the course. Our professors in the college, Darden is a case-based school, so the college is not. So the college professors have used the Teaching Resource Center more for figuring out the pedagogy of their classes and flipping their classes and what assessments and how they should change the course design to be in an online environment. But we don't, so we have an internal team, and people have been phenomenal with resources to bring forth pro bono resources to help us out to make this successful. But we don't have any sort of structured process of, okay, you want to do this MOOC, this is your team that's going to be with you to figure out what type of assessments to do. It's based on the professor, as Daphne referenced earlier when she was talking about, I don't know if it was the grading policy of how many times you could take a test. That, somewhat infuriatingly sometimes is totally defined on what the professor's interests are and what their experience is. So we don't have a UVA policy for that. I don't know what the second question was.
Do you want to say something about what support Coursera provides for all this stuff?
So we do have, is that a hint? Yes.
Well, I mean, that was a question.
Okay. So Coursera does have a course operations team. And there's also a MOOC on MOOCs. So we're trying to figure out how we can leverage. Yes. Yeah. We're trying to figure out how we can leverage university partners to get that information and best practices from other universities. We've learned short answer is really not a good idea in this environment. But we do have a course operations contact. We have one that we'd like to clone. I think Pengwei is just awesome. Yes.
So that's, I think, part of the answer, and I think the second part about what we've learned on pedagogy is, I think, currently we've learned some things, and I'm going to say something about that at the talk today, so given the lack of time, I'm not going to go into this right now, but I think that there's a huge opportunity here to leverage the amount of data that's being collected to really understand what are effective pedagogical practices, at least in online teaching, in ways that have just not been possible until now, and really to improve pedagogy via an iterative cycle that hasn't been available in this field before.
Thanks for coming. I have a question. I think it's twofold as well. You might answer it as you wish. So one thing is, I wonder when you were creating the business, if you thought on the consequence part, like what would happen in the other side of the country and what happened here, like last summer, and
I cannot take responsibility for what happened.
No, but no, not responsibility. I'm just saying that, like, have you thought on how to measure value and how you would considering by then, and how you're measuring value now going forward from creating net value to society to the business itself?
I don't know how you measure value. That question is too philosophical and abstract for me. I mean, how do you measure the value of education to people? I mean, you could measure it very, I think, boringly and concretely. And okay, if you have a college degree of a certain type from a certain institution, how much does that increase your lifelong earnings, for example? Is that really the primary measure of the value of education to society? What if you are just learning stuff without getting a degree? Does that have zero value now? I don't know. I don't know how to measure that. But I can tell you one thing, which may or may not answer your question. If you look at the range of problems that plague the developing world, ranging from malnutrition, infant mortality, infectious disease, AIDS, overpopulation. I mean, you could just name extremism. You could just list them. You stratify any one of them by years of education, correcting for all other factors. Years of education reduces the severity of the problem to the point that when you get to the most educated people within a society, correcting for all their factors, the problem in most cases goes away. There is this hugely strong correlation, for example, between the number of, the most predictive factor of the average number of children that a woman has is the number of years of education that you give to girls in that society. So, I don't know. I think education has value in so many dimensions that I can't even begin to count.
Just curious if you had any measure you were tracking since then, or
Tracking.
No, since the beginning. I mean.
I don't know what I'm tracking. So.
Hi. So I know that you guys haven't been around for a long time, so I'm not sure if this question is premature. But in terms of your international population of students, does Coursera have a vision for where that population is going to go in terms of growth or demographics, and what kinds of value proposition you can offer to people in emerging markets where the possibility of a degree is not possible?
I mean, I think that was definitely one of the goals that led us to this, is to serve those countries that are under capacity. If you look at, certainly at countries in Africa, but not even just. Look at India. I mean, relatively an emerging economy as these things go. And the capacity issues are enormous. So India has a plan right now, a goal, to increase its tertiary completion rate from 13 to 20%. The calculation is that in order to achieve that, they need to build, if they want to do it traditionally, using traditional education, they have to build 1,500 academic institutions in order to serve those people. Now, here's the untold secret about Indian education. Once you go below the top tier, the IITs, the IIM, University of Delhi, and so on, these institutions are at about 25 to 50% FTE in terms of the number of instructors that they currently have, because they just cannot find qualified instructors to fill the number of positions that they have. So if you build 1,500 institutions, ignoring the logistical nightmares of building 1,500 campuses, who are you going to find to staff those academic institutions? So I think the only viable solution for building capacity in the developing world is online education. Basically leapfrog brick and mortar in the same way that you leapfrog landlines. And because otherwise there's just no way in a reasonable amount of time, an amount of time that's sufficient to bring the country into a 21st century economy. It's just not possible to build that capacity, I think, in any other way.
We have time for one more question.
I know we've mentioned flipping the classroom a bit and extending education to the emerging markets. To what extent do you see Coursera or other similar organizations moving not just from the master's level and university level, but to the K-12 education, to actually start education in some emerging markets where they don't have access to the elementary and secondary that we do here?
Well, I think that's a really good question, and one to which we only have a partial solution right now. A lot of the content that's coming online right now, the introductory math, introductory physics, is actually equally good for high school students, and you can easily imagine pushing down even further into middle schools. I don't think that what we have right now is the right user experience for teaching a 7-year-old how to read. And so I think for that to be solved, you actually need a different experience. I think you actually need a live teacher, because so much of what a teacher does in those lower levels is just teaching basic behavior, study skills, sitting down, staying on task, the kind of things that 7-year-olds are not necessarily very good at. And by the way, now there are 17-year-olds, but that's a separate issue. So I think that there is that I think requires something else, and I think one of the things that we might be able to help with down the line is not just train students, but train teachers who could then go and teach students in primary schools, and so come at the problem from a different direction. So, but yeah.
Daphne, I think I'm sorry we're out of time, so we're not going to be able to have all the questions. I should have said, for one last question, I should have said any question other than mine.
He paid for lunch.
So I just wanted to say one thing, ask one thing. What does it felt like to lead and try to grow a company that has grown at the pace it's grown over the past 8 to 10 months, where you've gone from 0 to infinity, and I think the pressure must be extreme. How's that been for you?
So I can answer that very briefly. The answer is surreal. For large parts of time during the year, I felt like the main character from Being John Malkovich. So, I look at somebody, I look out through eyes and I'm saying, this is not my life, this is somebody else's life. I don't recognize this life, but it's been, I think the impact has been so large and so palpable that I think it's just, you just can't sort of let it go, so.
Well, on behalf of the Darden School, and certainly on the Entrepreneurship and Venture Capital Club,
and Education Club as well.
And the Education Club. We can't thank you enough. You share a lot of our values for making sure that people get educated around the world. And to see you so passionate about that and holding firm to the values of keeping this free and accessible are heartwarming. I could say from the University of Virginia, we give you the greatest thanks. And we wish you all the best of luck and sleep.
Thank you. Thank you.